Welcome to our last speaker event of the semester. We have with us today Alex Burghart, the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. He's going to tell us a little bit about himself and then we'll get into the questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming to listen to me speak. It's always a very strange experience talking to students, because you will find that when you get old, there's a part of you that assumes that you're still young until you meet young people. And I'm about 20, probably about 26 years older than you, and yet it feels like a very small fraction of my life ago that I was sitting where you are. It's one of the things that really I don't remember anyone telling me when I was young, was that as you get older, the speed of the passage of time increases dramatically, and to the extent that you're invited to reunions at university and you think, I saw most of these people quite recently, and you realise it was 10 years ago. And when you work in politics, the speed of the passage of time is very different as well. Indeed, I feel at the moment that we are living in, and have been living in, this extraordinary period of acceleration, the like of which hasn't really been seen, or most dimensions hasn't been seen since the middle of the 20th century. The Second World War was a unique period of accelerated time, probably the period of greatest change ever in human society. But when probably in 10 or 20 years' time, there'll be clever historians or political students doing PhDs on the period between about 2008, when the financial crash happened, and say 2028, by which time we will probably understand what the balance of power between China and America is in the Pacific. And people will say that within those 20 years, a century of history took place. And by that I mean that 2008 was the worst financial crisis since 2029, that what followed was in the UK the biggest constitutional crisis since Irish independence in 1916. What then followed that was the greatest pandemic in a century since Spanish influenza in 1919, and then the biggest land war in Europe since 1945, which created the biggest energy crisis since the 70s and the worst inflation since the 1980s. And all of this has sort of broadly coincided with my career in politics. And I wasn't a politician to start with. I studied history at university. I'd always been very interested in history. I was lucky enough to grow up with my great-grandmother, who was born in 1895. And she had been brought up by her grandmother, who was born in 1815. And this meant that I had this, from a very early age, I had a sense that I knew someone who had spoken to someone who had known people who were alive before the French Revolution. And that actually the past is very close to you. The past is, if you find the right sources, the right people to talk to, the past is with us. It's in the next room. So I went to university. I studied history and had a wonderful time. So much so that I ended up doing a doctorate in early medieval English history and the formation of the state, which turned out to be the perfect training for becoming a Conservative MP. The reason I ended up studying that period was because I was part of that generation in the 1980s that lived in a way with the spectre of nuclear war. That although in the 1980s we saw glasnost and perestroika and the Soviet Union opening up to the West and eventually peace, there was, as a school child, there was a profound sense that a miscalculation at any point might lead to the end of the world. And so coincidentally, perhaps no coincidence, that when I went to university, I became very interested in the last time that society had totally collapsed, which was the end of the Roman Empire. And to a very potted account of that period, in around about 400 in Britain, most people in lowland Britain are speaking Latin, living in cities, building in stone, using currency, using mass-produced wheel-thrown pottery, part of a trading nexus that stretches from North Africa all the way up to the Highlands of Scotland. And within 100, 150 years, people in that region are not living in cities, they're speaking German, there is no currency, they're no longer Christians, they're pagans, and everything has changed. And yet what emerges from that over the course of a couple of 100 years is the most stable constitutional monarchy and centralized state to be found anywhere in Europe, which is still enduring, with the possible exception of Denmark, but I digress. And so I became very interested in that. But then when I was, it was around about 2006, 2007, I started to think that maybe the world was a bit bigger than early medieval history, and that I should try and get involved in it. And I wrote to David Cameron, who was then leader of the opposition, and said, I'm teaching at King's College London, which is where I'd done my doctorate. I'd stayed on to teach and lecture. Teaching at King's College London, and I think there are some things that are wrong with the education system in England. And I think you're going to be the next Prime Minister. And if you like, I will give you some of my time to work on this. And it's back in the days of letters, and I got after a while back, I got a letter Willett saying, no, thank you. Yeah. And then a few days later, my phone rang, and it was someone in David Willett's office who said, did you say for free? And I said, yeah, all right, why not? And one thing led to another, and I ended up working for Michael Gove in the Department for Education after the 2010 general election. And then I did a bunch of jobs in think tanks, and I worked for Barnardo's Centre for Social Justice. I was the Deputy Children's Commissioner. And when Theresa May became Prime Minister, I had a phone call from her Chief of Staff saying, would you like to join the policy unit in number 10? And this was just after the Brexit vote. David Cameron resigned, Theresa May became Prime Minister. And I went and worked on welfare and a bit on education, and discovered that at the centre of government, get in number 10, you think, this is it, we're in control. And that, but actually the levers in number 10 are not attached to anything. And it was my first experience of the peculiarities of the modern British state, where power is actually, insofar as power exists, power is spread between a number of different bodies who are not necessarily working together. Number 10 has the political power, the Treasury has the money, and the Cabinet Office controls the relationships between government departments. And they are, we can talk about it subsequently, but yes, I discovered that that government is more peculiar and idiosyncratic, and often less effective than most people would ever give it credit for. And then one morning I went to, before I'd done that, I stood in the 2015 general election in Islington North in London, where I was living at the time, against a guy called Jeremy Corbyn, who was not famous. Nobody apart from sort of political geeks like myself knew who Jeremy Corbyn was. And I came second. I lost by 24,000 votes. And it was a fascinating experience, because I thought that I was watching the dying embers of the hard left in the UK. My first hustings, I went to Islington Town Hall, and somebody in the audience asked a question about the health service, and I said, the internal market within the health service that the Conservatives set up has been effective at driving down costs and improving outcomes for patients. This can be seen in comparison to its sister service in Wales, where that hasn't happened. And then Jeremy Corbyn stood up and said, we will drive out all private sector involvement from the health service and make it a truly socialist body again. And then Bill stood up. And Bill was the Socialist Workers' Party candidate, because only in Islington North would Jeremy Corbyn be considered too centrist. And Bill stood up and said, well, we will abolish money. And then a guy stood up in the audience and said, well, speaking as a member of the Communist Party, I believe that only violent revolution will free the masses from the tyranny of the bourgeoisie. And a lot of people nodded thoughtfully to themselves. And I thought, I am outgunned in this room, but this is surely the last citadel of sort of proper socialist thought in the country. And then a few months later, Jeremy took over the Labour Party, which was, you're perhaps a little bit too young to appreciate the scale of what that was at the time. That it was, and I had several meetings with the lead Conservatives at that point saying, I think he's going to win, and I was laughed out of the room. And I wrote an article for Conservative Home saying, I think Jeremy Corbyn's chances are underplayed. And then a few weeks later, I tried to get Paul Goodman to publish an article saying he's going to win. And Paul wouldn't publish it because he said it was ridiculous. But it was the first sign that there was a large contingent of people in the Labour Party, and as we saw in the 2017 election in the country, who were looking for something different. And who were looking for an alternative to mainstream political thinking. And so I was elected in 2017 after Theresa called a snap election, which she didn't lose, but she also didn't win. And in that election, I had assumed at first that the Conservatives were going to win a large majority, 17 points ahead of the Labour Party. There was no way that Jeremy Corbyn was going to get a lot of votes. And I thought that I would probably spend my first Parliament quietly irrelevant, on the back benches, maybe writing a book about Anglo-Saxon Essex and coming to kind of terms with the place. But instead, we were thrown into this extraordinarily unstable Parliament where politics had a huge job to do and couldn't get it done. I then became Geoffrey Cox's PPS. Geoffrey Cox was the Attorney General who was involved in the negotiations with Barnier in Brussels, negotiations which never really worked out because they knew that we didn't have the political leverage because we were in a minority. And I then became, when Theresa had to resign, I was asked to be Boris Johnson's Parliamentary Private Secretary. I didn't know Boris at all at the time, and suffice to say, it was not boring. I watched, and I was more an observer than a participant, but I watched Boris and Dominic Cummings take the Conservative Party from a position where we had got about, I think, 9% in the European elections in the early summer to a landslide majority in December, which was, whatever else it was an absolutely extraordinary political achievement, really masterful. And but then within 12 weeks of that victory, a virus had emerged from China, and within a few months after that, I was on the phone to someone in Number 10 telling me that the Prime Minister had gone to hospital and had a severe case of COVID. And I then phoned up my best friend from school, who is an A&E doctor, and said, "This is what's happened. What do you think is going to happen?" He said, "Well, he's mid-50s. He's over. If it's bad enough that they put him on oxygen, he's probably going to die." And I then had to phone the private office in 10 Downing Street and say, everyone was in shock, and say, "We're going to have to make contingencies for if the Prime Minister dies." And that was, amongst everything else that's happened, that was quite a real moment. But also very unreal. So we get through COVID. I become Minister in the Department for Education, working on apprenticeships. I then became, under Liz Truss, I became Minister for Pensions, very briefly. And I then, under Rishi, went to work in the Cabinet Office, working on the British Constitution, on government contracts, and, as you find out in the Cabinet Office, any other nonsense that has no natural home within government. So I had this, you got to get this wonderful overview of what happens backstage. And then but one of the people who was elected with me at the same time in 2017 was Kemi Badenoch, who became a friend of mine and by whom I was very deeply impressed from the outset. The originality of her thinking, the originality of her political style, the fact that she is uncompromising, thoughtful, and direct in a way that I'd long to see in the British political class. And so when she said she wanted to run for leader, I said I would support her. And now we are the official opposition, but at a historic low, faced with a new and highly vigorous party on our right as a political challenge that really no Conservative party has had to deal with before. And with the prospect of the American economy going into recession and the whole scheme of geopolitics with which I grew up in the post-war period appearing like it might change. Anyway, that's what I've done so far. I think it's probably best if you ask me any question you would like to ask me.
Thank you for a great background on yourself and your path into politics. Can you just, for those that don't know or understand, what is it exactly that you do as the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and as Shadow Secretary of State of Northern Ireland?
So yeah, the job of the opposition is to hold the government to account. So you ask difficult questions of the people you shadow. I'm lucky I shadow two people who are very good. I genuinely respect them personally, respect the way they do politics and the way they think about government. They're Pat McFadden, who's one of Keir Starmer's sort of closest confidants, one of the few people who was in government before 2010 when Labour were last in power, and Hilary Benn, who's the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and the son of Tony Benn, one of the most sort of prolific left-wing politicians of the 20th century. And the Cabinet Office, as I say, is kind of the wiring of government. And so Pat McFadden has set up an attempt to convince people that the Labour government knows what it's doing, set up the plan for change, and a whole bunch of criteria by which the government should be held to account. So we do that. And Hilary Benn is involved in making sure that the peace process in Northern Ireland is maintained, making sure that the institutions in Northern Ireland, like the Assembly in Stormont, continue to work. So the old job of opposition is to make government's life uncomfortable by asking them difficult questions.
So following on from that, what are some particular lessons you've learned from the transition into opposition? How have you found it?
It's a completely different job, to be honest. And I used to have, in the Cabinet Office, I had about 11,000 people working for me. Now I have 4. I don't mean 4,000, I mean 4. And there's less to do in opposition, but you kind of go, you go right back into the world that I lived in between 2008 and 2010, where in opposition you don't really have any resources. You have some people who are good enough to give you their time for free. You have some, you can pick on the wisdom of older generations, but you're like a startup. You have to do most of it yourself, and you have to you have to keep your eyes on the prize and not get distracted by the things that very easily might be easy to do or might sound nice. like coming to talk to students at UEA, rather than the things that are actually going to either help, firstly help you prepare for government, and secondly help you get into government by making sure that the current government can't get away with making bad choices and doing bad things.
So there's this system currently where you've got this shadow cabinet holding the government to account, as you said, making their life difficult. How do you think that system could be changed or reformed so that the opposition can hold the government better to account, so we get better government?
I don't. It's a very good question, and I don't actually think that there are many things that could be done within Parliament to make accountability better. There are some. One of them is that Parliament doesn't actually sit nearly as much as it used to. That often debates on long pieces of legislation are heavily truncated into a few hours. And although there is line-by-line analysis that's done in committee rooms, but committees are very small subsets of Parliament. I often think that it's in Parliament's interest and the law's interest for us to just spend more time on the boring stuff. Spend more time. Most of the time you'll watch Parliament on TV. You're watching Prime Minister's questions, and there's it's a big fat row and everyone's screaming at each other. Outside of that, it tends to be much more civilised and not consensual, but civilised. And actually, when you start talking about legislation, you can get into genuinely practical considerations. And as a minister, you never necessarily admit that the opposition are right, but you do sometimes take on their ideas, and that's it's a productive part of the process. So I think that's a simple change I'd make. I don't support state funding for massive state funding for opposition parties. I do think that there ought to be better planning around transition. So as you approach a general election, there ought to be more civil service disposal put at the more civil service resource put at the disposal of opposition parties to help the civil service plan for a potential change in government.
Okay, so moving into your time when you were in government, as Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, what was that like? And do you have one particularly memorable experience that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, yes, Boris nearly dying. That was, that was no Prime Minister has died in office since Palmerston, had a heart attack on his billiard table in the 19th century. And actually, I don't think he died quite. Spencer Perceval was shot. So that was, that's something I'll never forget. But there are so many moments. Coming out of COVID, on the very last day that we got rid of the last COVID restriction, the Russians invade Ukraine. And at that point, you start to think, is this just a kind of like TV series? Is this sort of box set? We're just going to move into another season now, where another bunch of crazy stuff happens. And also just watching, the rise and fall of prime ministers, all of the general elections, and seeing in the last general election a number of my very good friends lose their seats, and that's that of itself changes the working environment, changes the nature of the political party, changes what your capabilities are. So, yeah, it's one day I might write it all down, but by the time I have time, I'll probably have forgotten it all.
So I want to ask you very briefly about Northern Ireland.
Yep.
Though I suspect it's hard to give a brief answer. As I mentioned earlier, we had Lord Hayne at the beginning of the semester telling us about the agreement he helped broker, and obviously there's still lots of issues in Northern Ireland, and there's not really stable government. What do you think can be done if you were Secretary of State for Northern Ireland rather than Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland? What would your approach be to try and fix that?
Well, that is a very good question, and one of the things that I'm trying to work out now. And one of the great things about opposition is that you have time to think. In government, you don't really have time to think. In government, the events of the country just come at you very thick and fast, and you have to deal with the day to day. In opposition, you get to plan, and I think that for those of you who don't know, the system of government in Northern Ireland is one of inbuilt power sharing. That's to say that you have to have someone from the unionist side and someone from the nationalist side working together in order to form an administration. And that means that no community feels left out, and it also means that it's very difficult to get decision making, and it's very difficult to get compromises. Let's say if something bad happens in one area, you have to weigh that out against something for something good or something on the other side. And it means that Northern Ireland has, it's one of the reasons why Northern Ireland has the least effective public services anywhere in the country. And I have spoken to people who have been told that they will have to wait 8 years for a particular type of operation because of deficiencies in the health service. And this is not sustainable. I mean, at some point, something will have to give. Now, you could, one solution would be to say, peace process has been running since 1998. We're now in a new age. We're going to move beyond power sharing to simple majority voting. And that would be a very big step, because it would mean potentially that you would get factional politics. You might have Sinn Féin working with the SDLP and no representation from unions, or you might have the DUP and the UUP and the TUV all working together to keep nationalists out. And you would require, and that would probably lead to effective government or more effective government, but it would also potentially be politically destabilizing. And I don't think you could bring about that change without cross-party consent. And at the moment, there is not cross-party consent for that change. The other thing that may have to happen at some point is that I don't think that Westminster can stand aside indefinitely and just watch if this were to continue happening. If public services totally collapsed in Northern Ireland, I don't think Westminster could just stand by and let that happen, and you would end up having to do things differently in order to protect citizens in Northern Ireland. But hopefully what will happen is that the new generation, who seem to be capable of working together, Michelle and Emma, will be able to show that they can bring in the reforms that people want.
Thank you. That's very insightful. A question I'm sure you've been asked a million times, but since you're at university, what is some advice you would give to young people who are looking for a career going into politics?
In politics?
Yes.
Well, don't do it. No, and there are two types of people in the world. There are the people who want to be MPs, and there are people who don't want to be MPs. And the people who want to be MPs will do all sorts of crazy stuff in order to become MPs. And the people who don't want to be MPs will think that the people who do want to be MPs are crazy. And you will know which of these groups you're in. If you think, oh, I quite want to be an MP, it won't happen. That's not how the process works. It requires you to give up a lot of your time and a lot of your heart and mind in order to do it. When my first conversation on the subject was with wonderful member of the House of Lords who is very old. Well, that's not true, Bob. You're not very old. You're just the right age. I love you dearly. Who said to me, "Do you want to be an MP?" When I was an advisor, he said, "Do you want to be an MP?" And I said, "Well, I'm not really sure." And he said, "Well, that's not good enough. If you think you might want to be an MP, you're going to have to do a lot of work, and it will probably take 10 years. And if you don't do it, it won't happen." And I thought, okay, all right, I do want to do it. I'm going to do this. What you need to do is and I break this down into rational advice. So you leave university and you say, I'm going to spend 10 years building a career and crucially earning some money. I mean this. Go and earn some money. Get a property, a flat, anything. Just get something that's yours. Get some capital put away, and have a career. Do a thing that you love, that you believe in, that you that you feel makes a difference. Either even if it's going and working in financial markets and understanding how that bit of the world works and paying your taxes and contributing to society that way, or whether it's and I went and taught medieval history, and which was not financially lucrative, but I did enjoy it, and I've rarely regretted it. But you go and do a thing that is not politics. And whilst you're doing that, every couple of weeks, do something for the political party of your choice, and volunteer. Go and campaign in by-elections, go and meet the people who do the job. And over time, you will build up experience and a reputation and a network, and that will be very, very helpful to your personal development and to your political development. And read a lot. Just read as much as you can, history and policy, and argue with people, argue with your friends, and your allies and your opponents, and learn what it is you really, really think, and learn what it is you really, really believe, and that will, and after you've done that, then you'll be ready to actually start the process of going into elected politics.
So you've spoken a little bit about your doctorate and teaching. So I'm interested how you think that we might be able to better integrate academia and academics into policy making to make it more effective and useful.
It is probably better integrated than you appreciate. That's to say, I often find myself talking to academics of one form or another, and government certainly talks to academics of one form or another. So I think there's that as a politician, you have to consider the mind of academia, and you have to consider what businesses think, and what retired people think, charities think, and it's all part of the network. But did you have a particular idea of how you think academia and politics should be better fused?
No, not
okay, fine, all right.
I just find that you have people like yourself who understand the history very well, and could recommend very good policy and could be worked with very effectively. And it feels like we don't see that, even though maybe it is happening.
Yep.
We just don't.
No, it's and that's not to say that bad policy doesn't get made, but yes, it's it does. It does happen.
Thank you. So we'll head to audience questions now. There's a mic, so start with Cody. You can get the mic down there. Very eager.
So in the Almond report, Red and Blue, general election 24, it says a new coalition needs to be built with voters. And that will mean managing trade-offs between the pro-Brexit traditional left and your sort of more liberal conservative. So in your view, which sort of groups should the party be focusing on winning over in the next upcoming local election, perhaps in 29? And how can we sort of strike that balance between those tensions between those groups to maintain a lasting majority?
So I think that the best way of thinking about coalitions is to work out where are the common desires, and where does everybody, where is the shared vision of where we want to end up, rather than where are the grievances that we're trying to meet. And actually, when you do that, do what I described, you can build coalitions that, from voting patterns, seem unlikely. So I often hear people in Westminster, in journalism, whatever, talk about, this is a Liberal Democrat vote, And so consequently, this is what they think. They eat tofu and they wear sandals and they have sort of extreme views on the environment, and they want constitutional reform, and it's all sort of nonsense, right? And there are lots of people in my constituency in Essex who vote Liberal Democrat in local elections, and they vote Conservative in general elections. And there are plenty of people out there who are. The majority of people in the country are not overtly political. They are their day-to-day concerns are not about politics. They're about how they're going to pay their mortgage and feed their families, and where they're going to go on holiday, and what the state of their community and the economy is. And consequently, those people are available for one's vote if you know how to talk to them, and you can convince them that you want to take the country in the same place that they want it to go. So what the Conservative Party has to do, indeed what every political party has to do, is work out what that vision is, and why it's and make it compelling. And when you're in opposition, you have plenty of time to reflect on what that's going to be, but also time to look at how the mood of the country is going to change over the course of this Parliament. We are not 1 year into what is very likely to be a 5-year Parliament, given the state of the economy, given the state of the Labour Party's polling. And in every other Parliament since, so the last Parliament that was relatively straightforward was, when was the last Parliament was the relatively straightforward? So I was thinking 97 to 2001, but that's 9/11. There's always some massive event. 2010 to 2015 was relatively calm, relatively straightforward. There weren't massive international incidents. There weren't hugely unexpected events. So maybe 2005 to 2010, most of the time there is something that changes the weather, and you have to be ready with your values and your principles and your vision to deal with that when it comes.
Let's go in the end.
I'm from Doddinghurst, so it's quite funny.
You're from Doddinghurst?
Yeah.
Wow. When I first became an MP, Damien Green, who was a Conservative MP, said to me, "You've got about 90,000 people living in your constituency, which means that wherever you go in the world, there'll probably be someone from your constituency." And it is normally true, actually. And Damien described, I think, meeting someone in Nepal who was from his constituency. So, but I love Doddinghurst, and it's it's literally bang in the centre of Brentwood and Ongar.
Yeah, it's really cute. It's quite funny and quite cool. I've got an opportunity to ask you a question, even if neither of us are home right now. As I understand it, the Higher Speech in Education Act was passed to protect freedom of speech on university campuses, but it hasn't been implemented.
Correct.
Because there were several concerns for the bill. UEA has a certain reputation when it comes to free speech, and I think students would feel safer if an act was properly in place. Is there anything you feel the Conservative Party can do in their capacity as the opposition to ensure the issue is treated with priority and respect?
Yeah, we've been, Laura Trott and Neil O'Brien, who are our Shadow Education team, have been hammering Bridget Phillips and the Education Secretary on this, saying it should be activated. The bill, the act should be brought into force. And I think it's very sad that we've gotten to a position where legislation is needed on this. I taught at KCL up until beginning of 2008, and it just wasn't a very political time. And certainly when I was an undergraduate, it wasn't a very political time. There were very few protests about anything, and then suddenly, within a few years, somewhere between 2008 and 2017, university campuses became very radical again, or became very activist again. And I don't really know why that is, although the lazy answer is social media, as a guess, something to do with the algorithms. But no, I do, unfortunately, I think we do need some protections for free speech on campus, because otherwise universities are not going to be what they're supposed to be. And I at Oxford, on the founders board in the Bodleian Library, there's a wonderful quotation from the Book of Daniel, and it says, "Plurimi per transibunt et multiplex erat scientitia." Many shall pass by, and knowledge will be multiplied. And it's the most open-ended, wonderful vision of what a university should be. On this ancient staircase, you can imagine the generations coming by it and being inspired by it. And the idea of the university is that it should be universal. We shouldn't just have a group of people who all think the same thing. That is not the academic dream. And it's tragic that there are some people who are trying to shut down certain voices on campuses in our country.
Thank you.
So just the next person, make things easy.
You said that you were in the Liz Truss cabinet.
I wasn't in the cabinet. I was a junior minister. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about your experience in that.
Yeah.
The shortest prime minister we had who didn't die. What was it like behind the scenes in those 49 days?
It was pretty wild. I mean, I should be clear that there's, it wasn't that everything. I think what was unfortunate about what Liz did was that it wasn't. I think it's safe to say it wasn't very well thought through, in that she had a very clear sense of what she wanted to do, and the end point is quite a desirable conservative vision of the economy. She wanted, lower tax and lower regulation and higher growth. But the way she went about it was to say, I am going to cut taxes and increase spending, and I will deregulate in the future. And the market said, that's not really a plan. You need a plan. And so I, as Minister for Pensions, one morning I had a civil servant knock on my door and say, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England would like to speak to you. And I said, what now? He said, yep, right now. And I said, I'm going to guess it's not good news. He said, I don't think it is, Minister. And it wasn't good news. It wasn't good news. And that was just before the Bank of England made a very substantial intervention in the economy in order to prevent bad things from happening. So, but as is often the way, it wasn't the main event that brought Liz down. It was the main event created huge political turbulence, and then it was her attempt to force through a vote on fracking without having consulted the parliamentary party. And I had one colleague walked into my office, which was just below the Chamber of the Commons, and sat on the floor and said, that's it, she's going to have to go. And by the time I got up to the chamber, and within 24 hours, she was no longer Prime Minister. So it was an experience I hope not to relive.
Let's go here.
I was at account with James Cartledge on the night of the election, so I know exactly what you were talking about earlier with losing colleagues before your eyes. That kind of sinking feeling was pretty horrific. But my question is, in the last election, you got a majority of just under 6,000 and are quite a well-known figure within the party. You would probably never be the director, and I'm sure you'll admit, a director of a vote of no confidence in Kemi, being quite a close ally, I've heard. But would you ever attempt to be her successor?
No. And I don't think it looks like a very nice job, and I don't think I'd be very good at it. And I think there's probably, I can't think of anything worse than sort of, becoming, somebody becomes leader of the Conservative Party and then can't do a good job of it. I think that would be an unhappy experience for. So no, I don't have any. Everyone can rest assured that I have absolutely no ambitions in that area.
Thank you.
Correct. Next.
Thank you. Yeah. So, with the result of the local elections, with Reform sweeping a lot of Conservative seats, do you think that Kemi is doing enough to really regrow grassroots Conservatism across the country?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think we are still in the post 2024 general election phase, and I think one of the things that's happening now, which is slightly counterintuitive, is that because the Labour government has disappointed so many people, it is causing people across the political spectrum to look at radical options. And so I think one of the difficulties for the Conservative Party right now is Labour weakness. That if there was no Reform Party, I think we would be the natural beneficiaries of that. It would still be hard. Public have lost confidence in us. They kicked us out for a reason. But it's also true that Kemi represents a new generation of a political leader and a new way of doing politics that I think ultimately will be very appealing to a lot of people. I think right now, we had local elections in which there were very low turnouts. You had the motivation of people who were very angry and upset to go out and vote, and that boosted Reform's vote. I think what Kemi's successfully done since taking over, which is quite a mundane but essential thing, is raise money for the party. And that after a very bad general election result, there's a danger that a party gets a tipping point. You can't keep the lights on. You can't employ people. You can't mount effective opposition. And I think one of the underreported pieces of political news in recent months has been that Kemi has out-fundraised Farage and Starmer combined. Yeah, and that is, it's no guarantee of anything, but it is the last quarter of reporting showed that Conservatives have raised more money than the other political parties combined. But that is a sign that there are people who are prepared to back us long term. Effectively, there are people who are prepared to invest in the Conservative Party. So without that, things would be very bad. So Kemi has obviously spent a lot of her time making sure that we have the foundations to go forward. But obviously we have to show, we now have to turn that into electoral progress. There are two hands up.
Thank you. You might not know anything about this because it's not your department, but obviously coming from Essex, where the local elections were cancelled, where I'm from in Suffolk, where we are at the moment, all of the local elections, not cancelled, postponed. Obviously, in Norfolk and Suffolk, we're getting a mayor. I'm just wondering what your stance is. There's a lot of discussion throughout East Anglia about whether or not it should be one unitary authority per council, two or three. Just wondering what your stance is on this.
So, it's unusual to find people very interested in local government reform, but you're right to be. So the difficulty about local government reform, interestingly enough, goes back to Anglo-Saxon England, and I'm not even joking. That Essex is a former kingdom, as is Kent, the counties of the Midlands were carved up by the West Saxon Kingdom after it united with Mercia at the end of the 9th century. And so you have, if you look at the counties of the Midlands, they're very regular. They're all about the same size. They all have a central town which has a major river running through it. Actually a masterpiece of planning, extraordinary achievement extraordinary achievement of early medieval planning. And those Midlands counties, they naturally give themselves to unitarisation. I don't see any reason personally for them to have 2 tiers of government at all. One county can do everything. Essex is big, Kent is big, Suffolk is big, Norfolk is big. And I think having one unitary for the whole of Essex would be very disempowering for a lot of people throughout those counties. And the difficulty for Essex then is that I've been told by the people championing reorganisation that this is simplification, it's a good thing, but that we'll get 4 or 5 unitaries with a mayor and a strategic authority to coordinate, which doesn't sound that much different to having districts and boroughs and a county. And I'm concerned that you take children's services in Essex and you have to break them up in order to fit the pattern of the new unitaries. I worry about what that will do for vulnerable children. So I am yet to be convinced. And I would very much have liked to have seen a very carefully worked through plan for what was going to happen in my county before we started postponing elections.
Hi, thank you for coming and talking to us. I just want to ask about your experience in Prime Minister's questions in the dispatch box. Actually asking questions. Kind of want to ask what that experience was like and how you prepared for it. Or did you have something acting as Angela Rayner for the questions?
Yeah, I got So for those of you who don't, I did Prime Minister's questions 1 week in November, I think, when Keir Starmer was away, and when the Prime Minister's away, the leader of the opposition stands aside, and the two, Angela as the Deputy Prime Minister, and me as the person that Kemi asked to do. I'm not Kemi's deputy. Did it, and I got a phone call on Monday evening from Kemi saying, Prime Minister's away on Wednesday, so he's not doing PMQs. I said, okay, well, fine, who should we get to do it? She said, well, you're going to do it. Right, okay, I'll do that then. And then, because life is busy, I didn't really think about it again until lunchtime the next day, I think it was, when it suddenly dawned on me that I was doing Prime Minister's questions in front of the whole of the House of Commons and sort of the country on telly, and that I ought to think about it. And the way I did it is different to how Kemi prepares. Kemi prepares with a bunch of advisors and somebody playing Starmer, and you rehearse questions and possible responses, and what I didn't feel keen to do that for some reason. I went and did what I normally do when I'm preparing for a speech. I just went for a walk and talked to myself. And you put your headphones on and people think you're on the phone and they don't think you're weird. But I now go walk around and talk it through. And I think it depends what type of brain you have, but I think it's generally a good tip for a lot of people when giving a speech. Don't write too much down because you end up reading it and you lose flexibility. Just work out 3 points that you want to make and then start talking to yourself and go through it and go through it and go through it. And after you've been through it a few times, it doesn't work if you need to speak for an hour, but it works if you're going to speak for 15 minutes. you'll find that actually you just start talking and you sound more natural, and you're more interesting to listen to. So I did take notes up with me. I have them in front of me because it would have been quite frightening without them. But yeah, so I thought about it a lot on the Tuesday afternoon and evening. And then I thought, I'm not going to sleep at all. So I went and bought there's a pizza place near me that does meters of pizza. So I bought a meter of pizza and ate it, and then sort of went into this food coma. And managed to get about sort of 5 hours sleep. And then you sort of get up and you practice in my room, and then you stand up at the dispatch box and go, yep, everybody's here. Shit. And then it's over because you're just asking 6 questions, and then it goes in the blink of an eye. I said to Angela afterwards, I take my hat off to you, because it's nerve-wracking enough standing up and asking 6 questions. God only knows what it's like to have to answer questions on any subject for half an hour with a full glare of the media and your colleagues on you. So yeah, it's I don't know how the people who have to do it for real live with it.
Can you give it to yeah.
Obviously, you mentioned that when you were a lecturer, you wrote that letter to David Cameron about some of the changes that you would make. Just out of interest, what were those changes? And assuming that they're outdated today, which they are, what would you kind of make today?
So, both of my parents were teachers. They were state school teachers in primary and middle. So I sort of grew up with education, and I sort of thought for a long time. There was a large part of my young life where I assumed I would be a teacher at one place or another, and I taught at a school just after I left university, and then went back to university. And I became aware whilst I was at King's, which is a very good university, it's Russell Group University. Students I taught were straight A students that they turned up and they couldn't write essays. Some of them could, small number could, but bright people who've been through the education system. I thought this is a signal that things aren't quite right. And if that's happening here, if these are straight A students at a Russell Group University, what's it like elsewhere? And I also had a sense at the other end of things, because my dad was a head teacher at a sort of deprived school in a deprived area in Southampton, where children would arrive at school at the age of 5, kind of still in nappies, sort of sometimes barely able to speak because they'd been neglected. That there was a cohort of kids who really weren't getting the opportunities that they deserved in civilized society. But the letter I wrote to David Cameron was not about that. That was something I became more involved in again when I was working in Michael Gove's extended team. I worked on child protection and children in care, looked after children. I worked at Bernardo's for a while on the same subject. But the letter I wrote to Cameron was about basic educational standards. And I became very attracted to the idea as I found out more, and I got more involved in the world of educational policy, to what became, or what had become, the Academies programme. In that, if you leap back in time, it's going to turn into a very long answer, I'll try and speed up. You go back in time, it used to be the case that all schools were run by local authorities. And that meant that they were not run by head teachers. I suppose this is the simplest way of explaining it. And actually, child of teachers, I believe that the people best qualified to make decisions about schools are probably head teachers and their staff, rather than administrators in local government or politicians. And if you have that, it's most likely that resources will be best directed to support children in the ways that are necessary, including taking care of those children who are most gifted and those children who are most deprived. Could I have another glass of water?
Do we have water? Is there a fountain outside?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Get to coding.
Cheers. So a little bit of a boring one, but I've been workshopping the policy of campaign on this. Are you familiar with ghost jobs?
With what?
Ghost jobs.
Ghost chops.
Yeah. So
I'm not familiar with ghost chops.
right. So just I'll be quick. But it's basically when companies have no intention of employing and they put jobs on job websites.
Oh, ghost jobs.
Yes.
Sorry, I thought you said ghost chops. I was thinking, is this some app I haven't heard of, or what, some social media site? Ghost jobs. Okay. No, I'm also not familiar with ghost jobs.
Right. So obviously, about 40% of job seekers say they've applied for jobs that weren't actually real. Obviously, this comes down to a few issues. So a boring little law called the Conduct of Employment Agencies and Employment Business Regulations 2003 has a little loophole where it covers agencies, but it doesn't actually cover direct employers. So an organisation called the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, which is supposed to go around and stop these companies from posting fake listings, isn't working right now. Underfunded, understaffed, and because of the loophole legislation, can't get it. So I suppose first of all, what I'd ask you, and I'll probably put you on the spot here, is whether obviously you could see maybe Conservatives potentially using that opportunity to advocate for stricter enforcement of rules and regulations on employment practices, because we need an ethical and fair business environment. And lastly, honestly, I think that covers it.
Well, you're right, and that was a very boring question. I'm joking. I don't know, but as a simple answer, you're absolutely right. There have to be fair practices, and people shouldn't be advertising jobs that don't exist. Why are they advertising jobs that don't exist?
Well, it's a mixture of issues from data farming.
Right, I see.
Sell it or to make it look like the company's actually growing. It's not actually. So misrepresenting.
Very interesting. I will go and find out more about ghost jobs. But yeah, I think it's a basic principle of the market that people should not be advertising things that don't exist.
Let's go with Rory in the...
Perfect timing. Yeah,
Is it okay if we go with Rory in the red because he hasn't asked a question?
Cheers.
In the back because he hasn't asked a question yet. If it's quick.
I'm going to be somewhat sly and ask you questions for my dissertation. So, looking ahead, what lessons should the party take from this defeat to rebuild support for future elections?
That's not a short question, is it? That's no. Look, there are a number of obvious reasons why we lost the 2024 general election, and it really comes down to trust. That we did not deliver on a number of things, a number of key issues, which we said we would. And we understandably gave the impression of being distracted by internal political concerns within our party. And these two things combined are politically disastrous. And so, first rule is if you're elected by the public to do a thing, you do the thing. And the second is you don't get distracted by things that the public aren't interested in. So that's as far as I'll go. There was somebody further back.
Hi, thank you. Just a question about education. So I spent from year 6 until I think it was October-ish in year 8 in a special education school. And
What was the specialism?
Sorry?
So what particular type of special educational needs do the children at the school have?
I think it was just mixed. I don't know really, but so my question for you is, as a lot of people in there actually very gifted, very clever, but can't function inside of non-comprehensive schools for various reasons. Do you think the government should reform this a little bit better and give opportunities to people who do deserve it, but unfortunately unable to have it?
I mean, simply put, yes. But do you have anything in mind?
No, I don't know.
Okay.
So I'm asking you, do you have anything that you think?
So I mean, this tends to be where the kind of the grammar school debate comes in, and which I think I've always felt is a sort of quite a simplistic answer to a complex issue. But I think that and a friend of mine, very good, very, very bright colleague of mine, Neil O'Brien, who is an obsessive Substack writer, says that he, and in his, to emphasize, is very, very clever. And he says that for him, he went state educated all the way through. He went to a selective sixth form, which completely opened his world, and that enabled him to go to Oxford and build his career. And I hate the idea of people like Neil not getting the opportunity to excel because there weren't the right resources in place. But I think that there also ought to be just a greater emphasis within education generally on, just as we rightly have a focus on children with special educational needs, and I've been a governor at a school for children with special educational needs, children with severe autism. We also ought to have a dedicated way of dealing with very bright kids, because they who will flourish from that resource and ultimately be an asset to the country.
Final question. Let's take last one from Ben.
I think there are two questions. I'm happy to take both of them.
Regarding the Greater Essex Authority,
I did not expect so many questions about the Greater Essex Authority.
I mean, I read it the other day and would be interested to see what you have to think. So we, as like the area run the county council, is probably going to be outvoted by Thurrock and Southend combined by, I think they get about 4 seats on this council and we get 3, even though we'd have 80% of the population. If this concern was to be eliminated through some compromise and it was more proportional, would you and your colleagues in the area be more amenable to the new authority?
It would be one of the considerations, but I want to know if my constituents are going to be joined with Thurrock. I want to know what's going to happen to Thurrock's £500 million worth of debt, and if my constituents are in the north of my constituency are going to be put in with Harlow, where there are much more serious social problems, I want to know how that's going to be accounted for. As I say, I don't feel that I have been told nearly enough about how this is going to work in practice, and consequently, I'm not yet prepared to support it, but I don't think anyone really cares what I think.
Nathan, you.
You touched on this earlier at the beginning of your talk. I want to ask you, what is needed in order to bring power back into the control of elected officials? You said that.
Sorry, say again, please.
What is needed to happen for elected officials to have power again? You said
So elected politicians, yeah.
That was difficult once you're in Downing Street. You weren't able to actually.
Yes, and so I think that there are a number of things that have crept in over the past 25, 30 years that we're going to have to address, right? That it became faddish in the Blair years for governmental decisions to be effectively isolated from the political process. So quangos, lots and lots of quangos set up where we'll show that this is, government will signal that this is an important area that ought to be run by experts, free from the meddling of politicians. And on top of that, we had a more rigorous legalistic approach to government, which is probably best represented, but not only represented, by the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act, various climate change acts, Environment Act, and so on, which enabled far more cases of judicial review to be brought against government decisions, and has tangled up the process of people being elected to do something and being able to do it, people being elected to do something and then finding that they can't, or that they get mired in a legalistic process which thwarts the outcome. I think what you really have to get back to is a world in which ministers make decisions and things happen, and if those things go wrong, they get voted out. If people don't like those decisions, there are elections. And I think that only in that world do you actually have full accountability. And if the minister is the person who is directly appointing the people who are running particular agencies, that's fine, because we know whose choice that was. That agency screws up, then the minister's the one on the hook for it, and the government's the one on the hook for it, the ruling party's the one on the hook for it. But a political system which has effectively split power, accountability, and responsibility is one in which it's harder for voters to have a proper influence on what happens in their country.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up?
Of course.
Do you think that happened under Blair because he wanted government to be less accountable, or was it more benign reason?
It's a really good question, and I don't know. I think it was more driven by a sort of vibe that, and I think it was driven by a sense, I think it was driven by, in one sense, an admirable idea that we'll leave it to the professionals. Politicians won't get involved. And that's fine, but the professionals tend to have a particular view on how to do things, and sometimes that won't align with what the government wants to do, and sometimes it won't align with what the public want. And also that Blair, as a particular type of barrister, had come from a world in which the law was sort of everything. Law is very, very important, but it's Parliament that makes the law. And if we forget about the importance of parliamentary sovereignty, if we downgrade that in the hierarchy of the Constitution, then what we actually end up with is a governing class of judges who are accountable to no one but themselves. And if you want to read, anybody is interested in that subject in any great depth, they will find a very eloquent account of it by Jonathan Sumption in his latest book, The Challenges of Democracy, which is brilliant, and which I reviewed for The Spectator. So if you want to read a much shorter version of the book, you can read my review in The Spectator.
So speaking of books, the final question we always do, what is one movie and one book you would recommend that has particularly impacted you or shaped your worldview? Or it's just very good?
Book. I mean, my favourite book when I was at school was the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, because there was no internet, and you could get an insight into the clever thinking of several thousand years of people. Did it influence me? I think the novel I enjoyed most when I was young was A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. The film, The film, I love Get Carter, Michael Caine, extraordinary, just absolutely brilliant piece of British cinema, fantastic performances, wonderful story, brilliantly dark. But what's a film that I should recommend that you watch that you probably haven't watched? You should watch Threads. And Threads was a film made at the height of the Cold War, English film. It's set in Sheffield at the start of a nuclear exchange between the West and Russia. And it's incredibly upsetting. If any of you are secretly hankered for nuclear Armageddon, you won't after watching Threads.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming in. Very interesting talk. Can we please give a huge thank you to Alex Burghart?
Thank you for having me. Cheers.